You want to talk crime, corruption, scams, murder, everything in between. I know it, you want it, you got it, and this is where you're going to get it. This is Two Steps East coming straight to you from Central Europe. I'm your host, a private detective, risk consultant, Preston Smith, alias P. Conrad Smith, alias Conrad, to my friends. I hope you'll be my friend. And let's get right into it and talk about what it's like to come up against organized crime or the mafia. You can picture me holding up the little fingers like the quotes. I hate it when people do that. But I want to talk about bring this down from the macro to the micro and talk about an individual. Now I've run into several cases where people were actually kind of attacked, their companies or themselves, their persons, by organized crime. And one case kind of sticks out. A couple of years ago, I was investigating a company up in near the Polish city of Białystok, and at that time there was money that was being diverted out. There were products that were disappearing. They had a lot of problems. This was a big company, but they did have a lot of problems, and nothing was showing up in the accounting, nothing that they could just latch on to, right? But it turned out that there were some various informants, as there are, and one informant led me to another, and I wound up dealing with this guy, and we'll call him Jacek, right? A fictitious name, but that's what we'll call him. Now, Jacek, let me describe him. He was probably 5'6", 5'7", tan, kind of dark skin, good looking guy, kind of had cool movie star hair, right? He had that going for him, wore a nice suit. If I remember right, the first time I met him, he had a nice watch, like I think even a Rolex, something like that. But he also sported a really bad black eye. First impressions. And you're like, for some reason, that black eye, okay, black eyes, I've had black eyes, right? In our business, sometimes you get a black eye. But the first impressions count, right? And I was like, well, okay. He looked successful, but that's an awful shiner. Then I noticed his shoes were kind of run down, ragged, and I go, maybe he's, there's something to this guy. But I knew there already was, because his story, he'd already done time. He'd done 2 years in prison and had just recently gotten out of prison. And he'd done 2 years for prison for basically aiding organized crime, an organized crime group, in basically theft, stealing from companies. And this mechanism was the same. The region was the same, the city was the same, and it turned out that, in fact, Jacek knew a lot about what was going on at said company, because he had done things like that for the mafia and actually tangentially probably had hit that company too. Now, that's actually not a special effect, that's real thunder. We're having storms outside. Now, when I talked to Jacek, he was very, very nervous. He was very upset. He wanted to, kind of elaborate means, at least in his mind, to try to meet where no one would see us or notice us. And I took that seriously, but the way he wanted to do it, I wasn't really convinced it was going to work. Okay, and it kind of didn't work, which we'll talk about later. I had several meetings with him, and he divulged various secrets and actually, in a way, tips that helped me on later investigations where the same type of thing kept popping up. I had one meeting, another meeting, a meeting that was aborted, then another meeting, and then Jacek disappeared. Gone, without a trace. I'm going to get into that story and what happened and what the lessons learned from that were. But actually, let's talk about what we're going to talk about today, right? Because I've been told I need to add structure to these types of things when I do these talks. I tend to ramble, but that's okay. A lot of us tend to ramble. But what we're going to talk about today is first, let's a lot of people have a hard time believing that the mafia exists. We see this stuff on TV. We see the Sopranos or like the HBO stuff or the Netflix shows or whatever, and we hear about the five families, and it all seems pretty kind of Guido-ish, and you can civilians, normal people, and I hope you never get affected, but a lot of people kind of don't. It seems like surreal, unreal, that it can't happen. So we're going to talk about the crime stats, and then we're going to talk about the types of crimes that are happening now. I mean, literally like this month, and we'll focus on Europe, not just Central Europe, but Europe, because it goes across borders, right? And then we'll get into signals, red flags that might indicate that your company has an issue. Your company is an issue, and this could be a serious issue. And I think you might be surprised, right? So let's get to it. Now, if we talk about stats and we talk about organized crime, and I asked you, how many organized crime groups do you think are operating in Europe? Well, a lot of people, and I understand this because you're not sitting in this kind of muck all the time. You would think, oh, I don't know, 5, 10, 100. I mean, and those wouldn't be bad answers. People tend to think of the Italian mafia and different kinds of the Italian mafias, and then there's the Russian mafia. And then maybe there's the Chinese mafia. But that's kind of not the way it works. You have really a high number of groups, and then you have smaller groups. And the smaller groups can be 5 to 7 members that are actually doing the bidding of the larger groups. Because it's not exactly the way now it is to a point, but it's not. The turf war type thing, of course, it still goes on. And a great example is you look at Mexico and you look at the different cartels and the Sinaloa cartels battling with other and okay, those are turf wars. We do see those still in Europe. We see those in Central Europe, in Russia, and in the stands. We do see that, but on the flip side, there are many smaller groups that are quite willing to work basically as specialists for other groups or with other groups. And sometimes these smaller groups, they might have 5 to 7 people. They might have 20 people. They don't have to be something like, a Cosa Nostra or some huge, or the Chinese triads, which is, nobody knows how many people, right? But if I asked you this number, I have a feeling that a lot of people would underestimate the count. Now, what happened in 2017 is Europol came out, and they said that there are more than 5,000 international organized crime groups that are operating right now in the EU. And that was up from 3,600 in 2013. Now, Europol comes out with these reports about every 5 years. And I think this time, because for an organization that, they've got their website, they have these press releases, but they really try to be very low key. And I don't know, I got a feeling that they came out with that report and kind of freaked everybody out, because this year in January, or maybe it was February, I don't remember, they came out with the next one, and they really stayed away from those numbers. But if you go back to 2017 and you look at these estimated 5,000 international crime groups operating in the EU, that was worth at that time an estimated 100 billion euros in revenue. That is the size of what we're dealing with. Now, of course, a lot of that, people think about drugs, right? And some of the drug busts are like obscene. Actually, almost exactly a year ago today, up in Gdansk, there was a huge drug bust, and they confiscated 3.2 tons of cocaine. That right there was estimated to be 3 billion zlotys worth of cocaine. 3 billion zlotys of cocaine, that's going to be less than $1 billion, but still, I mean, it's getting pretty close to $1 billion in one bust. And the guys that were involved, you had Germans, if I remember right. You had Germans, you had Colombians, you had, of course, Poles. Apparently, it could have been directed by one of the top Chinese triad leaders. And you think, well, okay, what does this mean? I mean, okay, that's in Poland, right? So you're sitting in Western Europe. Yeah, but the problem is all this is cross-border. If there's a port of entry, a delivery point, it's not just staying in Poland. Do you think the people in Gdansk, they're not going to snort 3 billion zlotys worth of cocaine? I mean, it's going all over the place. And the problem, one of the big problems, and this is what this Europol report said when it came out. It said they got away from saying how many gangs there are. I think they didn't want to depress us all because it's probably more than 5,000 now. But they did say that what is troubling is that they are observing a spike in serious violent acts. And this violence is not being confined just to like civilians, like what you call it, people who are not, they're not police, they're not gang members, they're not, they're just civilians, right? And this probably is coming from the drug trade. That's part of it. It's coming from gangs fighting over debts. But there are a few reasons, and some of them are not that obvious, as to why this violence is increasing. Well, one that's not so obvious is that the crime groups have gotten much more sophisticated. And the tactics, what they're using, means that when the police investigate them, they are failing more and more often. They can't make the arrest. And if you have you have people that are a little bit psychotic to begin with, and then they feel like they will not get caught. They will go unpunished. Yeah, they will be more violent. You also see more mobility of criminals in these support networks. So literally, you can have a crime gang that makes a deal with another, and they pop into a different city, do their deal, and a second crime gang is giving them the support and providing them with what they need. And this is straight from Europol, and that means providing them with firearms, explosives, surveillance equipment, counter surveillance equipment, this type of thing, which helps them remain undetected, but also helps them pull off maybe a heist, a truck heist, maybe diverting product to warehouses that don't even belong to them, but temporarily hold the product, then they steal it back from that. Some of the things you see are highly sophisticated, and also when there is a murder, when someone is killed, what do police do? They investigate it. And the natural inclination of police to solve crimes has been forever, what do? There's a murder, you talk to the immediate witnesses, you look for forensics evidence. It becomes very micro very fast, right? When in fact, it may well be that murder was part of a gang or an organized crime groups. They ordered it, and the person who did the killing is completely from a different country. Didn't know the person he killed. It's one of these hitman types of things you see in the movies. But that means there's no one, if somebody even saw the guy, there's no way he would recognize him. There's no clues. It's very difficult for police. But then there's another angle, and that is that more and more of these hitmen, these enforcers, they're young, they're inexperienced, and they're really, they don't have any sense of accountability at all with firearms and explosives. And so sometimes these incidents, they happen in crowded public places, or they're just completely, psychotic. I mean, we used to see this kind of thing very, very often, in Germany, Albanian gangs. I mean, there's a case I remember where there's an Albanian gang just walked into a bar in Germany, and literally a guy walked in, pulled out a hatchet, hit a couple of customers with the hatchet, killed them right in a public place to send a message that, hey, you need protection here, right? As crazy as that sounds, that was a long time ago. But in the late 90s and the 2000s, we had the gangland killings going on in Poland. You had a lot of violence in Serbian gangs. You had gang violence actually in Spain, where, crazy story where some Serbian mobsters, they went to Spain. Well, this wasn't in a public place, but these three Serbians, they actually they were setting up activities in Spain and living in a house, and they got into an argument with each other, and it's just crazy. Two of them killed the other one, and then what do you do with the body? And they made a stew out of him, and they ate him. At that time, I guess there were the tough guy mobs, and then there was the Serbian mob. It was kind of a difference, but what we're seeing now, these are acts, hits, or the use of explosives, even things that, is this a terrorist act or was this organized crime? Well, we're seeing a lot of kind of run over, but back and forth, and a lot of this comes from cocaine, right? 80% of the criminal networks now, according to Europol, in Europe, are actually involved in the trade in drugs, or organized property crime and excise fraud. That's kind of, but a lot of it is drugs. And when you come to property crime, that can mean a lot of things. That can mean organized burglaries. That can mean stealing property, like changing the ownership of property, etc. Now, before we pick on Poland and before we get back to Jacek, let me make this a little bit wider, because the tendency is, okay, the old EU countries, they look, Central Europe, Russia, whatever, and on the flip side, the Central Europeans go, Western Europe, whatever. But let's talk about Western Europe before we pick on a Central European country. Now, the UK. I'm just going to let's talk about a couple of countries, 3 countries, okay? We could talk about, also add in Spain, Belgium, we could do a lot. But okay, the UK. Give you an idea of the problem, which is shocking. The UK National Crime Agency, the last stats I saw, they warned that 181,000 of offenders arrested, right, had connections to serious and organized crime, right, in the country. 181,000. That's a lot of gang members, crime members. Germany. Now, Germany has, you think of Germany, yeah, it must be like this. Everything must be very formal, very set up, very organized. Crime is going to be low. That is actually not the case in Germany. They for a long time, they've had organized crime issues, and actually, the German police and the way they deal with it, they're fairly transparent. In some ways, it's easier to find out about the number and the kinds of organized crime groups in Germany than in many other countries. But let's give an example of what are they dealing with. Well, you've got the clans. Now, the clans have gotten some publicity. When I talk about the clans, you tend to think of the Turkish clans, the Kurdish clans, the Lebanese clans. They've gotten publicity for being very violent, for being the mafia in Germany, when actually they probably commit about 10% of the crimes. But you do have some pretty serious issues. You got the Remos family. They murder restaurant owners. They have like 500 members in their family. They commit all kinds of acts of violence. They've had a couple of big thefts that went back to them. They stole 100 kilos of like gold coin from Berlin's Bode Museum. That was like a $3 million heist. They hit there was something called the Green Vault robbery in Dresden. They were linked to that. Then you have, and they're actually kind of the Malami group, which is like Turkish and Lebanese. And then you have the Abu Chakrs, which are basically Pakistani. Then you have the Miris, which these are also Malami Lebanese. Then you have Al Zain, also from Lebanon. But then you have the other gangs. You have the Zemans from Serbia. You got the Tambovs from Russia. You've got now the Russian, a lot of the Russian mafia, of course, has a very bad reputation, deservedly, but it's more complex than it looks because you've got the Tambovs or the Solzhenskaya type gangs, and then you've got something in Germany called the Ausedliers. And the Ausedliers, they're what are the Volga Germans, right? So they speak Russian, but they're like a German ethnic group, and they're known for committing horrendous crimes, being very violent. Then you have the Vorvazakoni. These are the thieves-in-law. The thieves-in-law, they've been hit by Russian law, by U.S. law to try to eradicate them. They're very problematic. But a lot of those guys are actually from the stands, right? They're Russian, but they don't really have much to do with like the Russian mafia. They're separate. Then you have the motorcycle gangs, and you kind of, for Americans, you laugh, but yep, Hell's Angels, Mongols, the Bandidos. These guys can be quite violent, very involved in the drugs trade. Sweden has issues there too. There are European chapters. Then you've got the Italian mafia. You've got Camorra, you've got Cosa Nostra, you've got Ndrangheta. Actually, they actually published German police that they believe the Ndrangheta has about 1,200 members at least in Germany. Then you have the Turkish mafia, the Kurdish mafia. That's overlapping a little bit with the clans, but back in 2014, they published that there were 57 different Turkish gangs, 4 Kurdish gangs, and that number has only grown. You got the Albanian mafia, traditionally involved in prostitution, very violent. Afghan mafias, Arab mafias, Vietnamese mafias, and this is Germany. Okay, this is Germany. Now, if you look at Holland, you're looking at the same type of thing, but with the ports. Anytime you have a port, you think of Holland, you think of ports. Anytime you think of a port city, you've got gang activity and drug smuggling activity, and we've seen some real violence. For example, the police busted a gang in Holland, and in a port, they had taken 2 containers, sealed them off, soundproofed them, and to make them turn them into torture chambers. Like, you saw that movie Snatch, right, where, they put up the plastic sheeting. They did all that. Well, this was sort of Snatch to the 10th power, right? This is the kind of thing that is going on. Now, it's hard really for people to conceptualize, say, well, man, I don't have anything, it's not going to affect me. There have been estimates that organized crime probably costs the average British family £2,000 a year. You don't see it necessarily. You didn't directly get hit, but the overall, it is costing you. It's costing all of us. Now, let's revert back to Central Europe. And let me give you an idea of the types of crimes that are happening basically all the time here. Well, I hit a jingle there. I don't know if it's really jingle worthy or it fits the mood, but just a few things that have happened the first half of June. That's all. I want to give you, I mentioned the huge drug bust a year ago, but there's lots of things happening. But just in the first half of this month, a few highlights, and this is by no means everything. But mid-June, actually just a week ago, Lublin police, they busted a gang that were dealing in arms trafficking ammunition. And there's like 100 police involved, and I think there's still going to be more arrests. And they busted 7 guys. They hit 30 different facilities, so there's more than 7 guys involved. But listen to the kind of things that they found. 183 short firearms, 103 long firearms. Now, I've heard, I know this from a different source, that we're talking like machine guns, Kalashnikovs, that kind of thing. That's not verified, but okay. 73 essential firearms elements. That's like barrels, stock, so you can switch out the parts and make a firearm so it's not identifiable, which makes it valuable if you want to resell it. 3,000 different type, 3,000 rounds of ammunition, various types, 2 grenades, an artillery shell, 200 detonators for explosives, 4 edged weapons, these were like machetes. And then they also found some canes that had like the blades and canes, kind of like out of the movies, James Bond movies. They didn't find an umbrella, with radioactive poison in the tip. We haven't gotten that far yet. But these are the kind of things they bust in a raid. Now, another type of job, fictitious sales. A company was set up. They busted this gang also in early June, where it turned out some pretty sophisticated guys, 7 guys, they set up a company, right? 5 of these guys are actually under arrest right now, and they were falsifying documentation to steal EU funds. They got about 45 million in EU funds, and they were trying to get another 46 million. And to tell you the truth, I believe this had to do with producing masks, COVID masks. But the whole thing was just fraud. It was just fraud. Another type of bust, social engineering bust, where there's a German company that, in what social engineering is guys will get into your company, figure out how your company works, and then maybe they might hit your clients and send them invoices so that the clients pay invoices to someone else. They might divert money. There's a lot of things you can do with that. So we'll talk about social engineering in another show. But in this one, there's a German company that was getting scammed, and and all signs led to Poland. But it turns out the German police apparently got it wrong, according to the Polish CBSP. And the Polish police figured it out, made the bust, and the gang was made up of Polish citizens, Ukrainians, and Nigerians, right? That's how crazy, international cooperation is at its height. Now, they managed to steal at least $1.7 million from this German company. Right. When they made the bust, they found $400,000 in cash, and they got like 50 ATM cards, telephone cards. They got there was like 2.6 million in Polish złotys in bank accounts. I mean, these guys were actually good at what they do. Then there was a human trafficking bust, where there was a crime group that was sending luxury prostitutes to Denmark. The women would go to Denmark, stay for 4 weeks, make about 60,000 złotys, and then they would give back the money to the gang. That operation didn't last very long, but they made about 6 million złotys from that. And then there was a farm. This is all happening with organized crime just in the beginning of this month, just in Poland. They busted a pharma crime group, and organized crime sat on the heads of basically these guys that own these pharmacies. And they force them or coerce them to send medicine abroad. So sometimes if you're in Eastern Europe and you get a prescription, you go and it's for an antibiotic, and the lady goes, "Oh, well, I don't have that antibiotic, but I have this one. It's just as good." Well, I'm okay, but the doctor said to give me that one. No. Well, you don't feel it. All right, you give it, and it doesn't work. And then you go back, or and more serious, you can have people with chronic diseases that need serious they need a stable supply. Them, and sometimes you find that these medicines, they're not here. Why? Because they're being diverted to other countries where they can sell them for more money. They busted a gang that was doing this. All of these things going on all the time, right? And if you're in Central Europe, maybe you get these telephone messages, SMSs that say go pick something up, except you have to register here. Those types of crimes all the time. There's another big bestseller I want. We'll get into that in another show. It's quite interesting. How the police busted a cyber criminal gang, and when they brought all the cyber criminals to jail, it turned out none of them had ever seen each other before in their lives, and none of them knew each other's real names because they all used pseudonyms. So they got their introduction in jail, but a huge operation. We'll talk about that in another show. But now let's get back to Jacek. Now, here's the rest of the story of Jacek and what happened. The second time I met him, now the first time was kind of an introduction. He had a black eye. The second time I met him, he had 2 black eyes. Now, he'd obviously been hit again. He was a victim of violence again. His left eye was not, the one that he had a black eye to begin with in his left eye. It was still yellow and everything from the first time, but he must have gotten hit again because it was all red, like bloodshot red, like kind of hard to look at. And then his other eye was very swollen. It looked like the type of thing that, if you see in boxing, a guy has a fractured eye socket, very kind of sunken, very, very ugly. He had a split lip. He held his arm funny. He was wearing the same suit, and it wasn't, he didn't look as sharp. And I was, obviously a little bit disturbed by this. And I said, look, man, I mean, what's happening to you? And he goes, well, look, I'm having some issues because they want their money back. And what had happened is he had been stealing from the mob. Now, he got busted as basically being the point man for the mob. And when I say the mob, I'm not talking about like a crime, like family mob, like the Italians. I'm just using this loosely. It is an organized crime group, but hey, mob, mafia, whatever. It's more fun to say. Now, when he was the point man and he was engineering some of this theft, but then he got busted. And a lot of times what happens with the point men or the mafia soldiers, they're the ones that get arrested, and the higher ups are very sophisticated and they have the means to keep themselves from actually going to jail. I mean, you used to see this with the 5 families, or even Al Capone, right? Who finally went down on tax fraud, but I think even in the movie The Untouchables, like, he doesn't have any companies. He has nothing, right? So they make it so it's hard to trace the crime on the ground back to the boss. But he was the guy on the ground. He got busted. He went to jail. The problem was when he went to trial, the details come out, right? And so when the details come out, the cops start saying, yes, he stole this much money, he had this much money here, had this much money, I guess, in a bank account. And then, his overlords, they were upset. They were mad. Now, he goes to prison. Nothing happened to him in prison, or nothing that he told me, but he gets out and they want their money. So they start beating him up. And you say, well, why is the violence so low end, right? Why is it so low end? Well, it's low end because if you kill a guy, you can't get your money, right? So they are punishing him, putting it on him. Now, he didn't have any kids. He wasn't married anymore. He didn't have a good way for them to go after him like that. So they were just resorting to brute violence. Now, next time I saw him, I didn't see him. He didn't show up. We were supposed to meet. But then he got in contact with me. I'm not going to tell you how. Some things I have to keep secret. But we met again, and this time he even looked worse. And it's hard to believe you could look worse, but I mean, you almost couldn't believe he could actually get around and walk. He looked that bad. And I was like, look, I said, well, what happened to you? And he said that, man, last time I was on my way here, and I used my metro trick, and I was sure I had him off me, and I was cutting through a parking lot, and suddenly this guy, he just steps out of nowhere, a big guy, no neck, and he says, where do you think you're going? And I said, I don't know, nie wiem. And the guy said, do kosmosa, bop, which means to outer space. And the guy hit him in the face with a baseball bat, right? Laid him out. And I guess put a beating on him while he was laid out, because believe me, Jacek was moving slow, right? I mean, I have to admit, probably go to hell one day for this, because when he told me what happened, I almost just kind of started laughing, because in some ways it's just like, wait, how did this happen? And what is the metro trick? I don't want to get into minutia here. Minutia is such a great word. For some reason, the word minutia reminds me of Morse code. You're like, tick, 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 tick. I don't even know how Morse code worked, just as an aside. You know, the torpedoes coming, tick, 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 T, tick, 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 O. You know, I don't know how it works, but Jacek had a lot of minutia in his life, and it all led to something that was going to torpedo him, and most of it, though, led to the Mafia. Now, but I did ask him, what's the metro trick? And he said, the metro trick. Look, this is what you do. If you think somebody's on you, you make for the metro. Well, why the metro? Well, because you get in the metro, you zip all the way across town. You might go 3 stops. You might go 5 stops. You can get on, get back off, get on, get back. Then when you finally get off, you run up to the above ground. But in the meantime, you call a taxi, and the taxi's waiting for you. So when you run up above ground, you get in the taxi and you drive off. And the guy that's following you, he doesn't know where you're going to get off. He doesn't know where his driver should be. And that's the metro trick. And it always works. But this time it didn't work. He's like, all right, I'm going to remember the metro trick. But Jacek, look, I mean, you got some problems. I don't think you can keep getting beat up like this. And he said, do you think you can get me somebody, like put me in touch with a journalist that can like do a story? I go, yeah, I know a lot of journalists. Maybe we do. And he goes, I tell you what, next time we meet, bring the name of a journalist and let me think about it. And if it sounds good, then we'll meet. I'll just tell you everything. I'll tell you everything. And in the meantime, he was telling me some things, some small bits and pieces about how things work. But he said he was going to tell me everything, right? So the next time I met him, and I gave him the name of a journalist, but believe it or not, he was even more beat up. I mean, I was like, Cassie, you should be in a hospital, man. I mean, really? And I said, what happened to you? And he goes, look, I don't know how it happened. I was driving from Białystok to Warsaw, and I had this feeling that there was somebody following me, like there's someone literally following me. But I look in the rearview mirror, there's nobody there. I keep driving, there's nobody there. I drive for 40 minutes, there's nobody there. Finally, I had to take a break, so I saw there's a service station coming up, and there wasn't really anything between. There's like woods and fields and stuff. There's a service station, a petrol station, so I pulled off. And I got out. I went to the petrol station. I said, "Can I use the facilities?" And the guy gives me the key. And I go around back, and there they were. There's 3 of them waiting for me, and they just beat the hell out of me. And here I started. I mean, come on, what do you mean they're waiting for you? They're waiting for me. Now it sounds impossible, but probably they probably had a tracker on his car, which I mentioned. But anyway, to end this story, to make a long story short, because there isn't more to the story, we were supposed to meet again. He was supposed to tell me at that time if he agreed on a journo and to tell the whole thing, and he didn't show up, right? He didn't show up. Never saw him again. Tried to get in touch with him, tried to find people that knew him. That's it. He's gone. And I don't know if in the end, if anybody looked for him, if they investigated, if they tried to, sometimes you just don't find out, or I have a feeling he was just gone, forgotten. Now, for all I know, he could have hightailed it, taken whatever money he had left, gone to the Bahamas. I hope he's living he paid his debt to society, whatever. But pretty ugly story. But what were the lessons? What were the lessons learned from that? Now, some of these things I've actually seen in other cases. But there were some aspects that he brought up that were very interesting just from a psychological point of view, that were interesting for you if you're running a company, specifically with a lot of workers or a lot of storage needs or storage space. So maybe you're running a construction company and you have a lot of workers, or maybe you have like a manufacturing and you need to have storage of maybe supplies, goods, whatever. Now, these are the kind of things he mentioned, and they won't necessarily show up in your accounting, and not on, if you get a company like mine or another company come in and take the laptops and do the, nowadays in the detective business or the risk consultancy business, a lot of people take the laptops, look at the accounting, and we'll figure it all out. Now, for sure, that is valuable, for sure. But for sure, people in organized crime, they realize it's valuable, and these are the pros, and they're not necessarily going to show up when you do that type of investigation. So here are some things to look for if you're running a business that might maybe set off alarms, or even if maybe you're an investigator and you're listening, you might think, man, maybe we should have a look there. And part of this came straight from the horse's mouth. Part of it came from other investigations. Now, one is a lot of these guys in organized crime. Now, even though I said earlier that they work more and more often with each other, they're more loose, but many of them have that mentality that they kind of mark their territory. Some of them grow up young in gangs. This is our neighborhood. This is our block. The hooligan types, they go and you see when they paint this bridge or that bridge, that's the boundary. That kind of tradition still is there. And so there's a tendency for these guys to kind of mark off territory. And so that could be a section of warehouses, a container section, a section of the factory even, where you'll find that it suddenly becomes kind of off limits, maybe in a passive sense to begin with, maybe not. And it could be something as simple as, we're storing that maybe you, produce tractor parts or something, and we're storing the broken tractors in this part, and there's nothing really in there. There's no reason to go back there, right? Or we're a printing company, and the bad runs, especially in the old days, you had lots of bad runs with printing. Now it's all changed, but the bad runs, all that stuff is in there, and that's going to be disposed of. This kind of thing where you've got sort of an area of your company or your storage section that sort of becomes off limits. And you'll gradually get a feel for that, because employees will sort of avoid going there, or you'll hear gossip. And that could mean that, something is going on. Somebody is infiltrating your company. And you think, well, okay, that's kind of vague. It is kind of vague. But here's the next one. And this one is really interesting. And he pointed this out. And then I've seen it now, especially recently over the last couple of years, 2 or 3 times, I guess. 2 times we worked cases. One time I thought we were going to work the case, and then for some reason we didn't get the contract, whatever. But this is what I call kind of the barrack foreman. You could even call it the vorva method, the thieves-in-law method. Now, the vorva, the thieves-in-law, that's a type of organized crime group out of Russia. We'll talk about that. Some of these guys are crazy. But because of the legislation in the East, a lot of them were pushed west, and they brought their techniques here. So this is the kind of thing that you'll see, and I'll tell you where it comes from. But let's say that you have to have a lot of workers. Maybe you're a construction company. You got a big project. You got 100 people. You got 1,000 people. I don't know. But these workers, they might be in workers' barracks, especially if you're using less expensive labor. Like we had for a couple of years, just like 1 million Ukrainians came into Poland, and a lot of them went to construction. Now, what you may find is that there are the equivalent of kind of like barracks foremen that show up, that sort of come with these guys or quickly kind of rise to the top, to the forefront. And these guys will be almost like babysitters in the sense that they will they'll make sure the guys get to work on time. They'll sort out the vans or the buses. They'll make sure that, there's some sort of semi-discipline at the barracks. And you'll see that these guys are in a leadership position, and they might actually even request more money because they can be a help to your company. The problem with those guys is they have been inserted there. Or inserted themselves into there, and you'll find that they are forcing workers to pay them part of their salary, or even sometimes it goes as far as to it affects their families back home. And how do you recognize that? Well, just what I said. These guys sort of pop up. They're not really somebody that you didn't employ them for that position, but they start showing up in that position. Another tip-off is they may be from the same ethnic group, but they not always. They could be from an ethnic group they can speak the same language or similar language. For example, with the Ukrainians, you saw these guys that showed up, and they were actually more from the stands that were kind of the minders, right? Poles in the UK, I know of a case where, there was a UK British mob involved, kind of British-Irish, but the guys that were controlling the Poles and collecting from the Poles, they were Russians. Okay, so you sometimes sometimes it's going to be the same method. When you see this, you may go, what's going on here? Maybe we should try to get a handle on this before it gets in too deep. Now, we had a couple of cases where things really got out of hand before we got there, right? Where literally what we had were crime gang members that were sought, right? They were basically fugitives, and they came in with this torrent of Ukrainian workers. Now, the Ukrainians, I'm not knocking the Ukrainians at all. Great workers. The companies are very happy with them. But the way this works is, let's say if you've got to get these workers processed, okay? So you have human resource companies that were processing en masse Ukrainians, okay? Now, that means there's an office in Ukraine, and then there's going to be an office, say, in Poland or the Czech Republic, and they're processing them through because they got their paperwork. They got to get all the things they need to be able to actually work legally, and they were able to work legally, but there is a process to it, right? Now, if you are in organized crime, human trafficking is just one of the things you do, at least with these larger crime groups. And so what's the best way to get into human trafficking? Well, it's to do it legitimately. So some of these human resource type companies that are doing these really large scale projects, they were targeted, and sometimes passively, sometimes overtly. I know of one case where literally crime group came in and to push out the management. In other cases, like the ones we saw, these guys just sort of came with the flood of workers, but then they sort of surfaced and they were at the top and they were just collecting the whole time. But once they're in there, they're trying to find a way to stay. And so that's when it really gets difficult for the company. We worked a case where there was basically quiet threats that, hey, this person needs to be promoted. This person needs to eventually be, maybe on the supervisory board. We also saw something like this in Wrocław. Similar type of thing, very similar type of thing. Now, what's another tip-off to this is that you may see, at least if you're dealing with the warehouses, like suddenly there's pressure to change the security company, and you had a contract with a security company and it seemed like it was working okay, but then now for some reason someone in management wants to change that to some unknown security company. There's a lot. Why did he want to do that out of the blue? Another thing, though, which is really is a red flag, and that is incomplete personal documentation. Now, when I say incomplete, they have an ID. They've got like their foreign passport if they're a foreign worker, or they've got let's say if you're in Poland, you've got a Polish ID, a Polish PESEL, or let's say in the Czech Republic, or it's going to be the same in Western Europe too. Now, but in Eastern Europe, there's one thing that you can take advantage of in Central Europe, is that this documentation, which is such a pain in the butt a lot of times, because if you change jobs, you go there and the admin person, you gotta show them your ID, you gotta show them that you're legal, you gotta show them what's called świadectwo, which is like your work history of all these documents and everything that you've done, right? You need to show them your educational history, show them a copy of the diploma, and in most companies they'll have this stuff all on file. Now, it depends on who you are. Maybe you don't have, college education, whatever. But you'll find that these guys, a lot of times when you find people with incomplete documentation, it can't be completed. Why? They've got the ID, right? But they don't have this świadectwo. They don't have this work history, these official statements from their past employers, right? Or they can't show you documentation for where they went to school. We worked a case, and there was a Serbian guy, and he was an engineer, but his diploma was from like a missionary school, like a temporary missionary school, like to be a pastor or something. And so these types of things are tip-offs that just really shouldn't be ignored. Now, an example is we also worked a case for a company that distributed produce to grocery stores. Okay, and in this case, there's a lot of logistics involved with that. And you don't have much time because the fruit and the vegetables and everything go bad fast. So they had three IT guys that were really talented, very talented, so talented. Like, why are they working at a company like this? They should be working, I don't know, like with Bill Gates or something. But these guys were really good. The company was very happy with them. They were, super sharp. And then one day they just disappeared, and sold a lot of money. And when it came time to look at them, they called in the police, and then that job went dead, and they called us in to see if we could try to help them. But you could see right then that, look, they never had any kind of complete documentation. These guys just were not real from start to finish. You just can't accept the ID that somehow might be falsified and run with it. I don't even know how the company was paying them legally, like the insurance payments and all that. They were really short there. Similar case in the Czech Republic where there was a financial controller. They thought he was Czech. Turned out he wasn't Czech. He was probably Serbian or Montenegrin. He might have been Ukrainian. They had no idea who this guy really was in the end. And they figured that out after the fact. Now, I'm going to give you one more. There's actually a bunch. But some of these things, these issues, maybe you got too much breakage. Maybe you got, you feel the money is not there, and you say, oh, well, yeah, we should see that with the accounting. I mean, just do a forensics accounting check. Yes, I agree. However, there is another target in companies that we've seen too often, okay? And that is basically your admin person or your CFO. Now, the reason I'm highlighting this one is because it's a very specific target, and I don't want to sound chauvinistic or whatever, sometimes I probably do, but this target can be someone who's been a long-term employee, usually female, somewhat elderly. We've seen it several times now. And it's sad how this ends. This is sort of another kind of Jacek story in the sense that, for example, you've got a woman getting older, had kids already, the kids moved out, divorced, probably lonely, and she is head of the company accounts. Well, she winds up with a new man in her life. And she's happy. A few months go by, more time, and the company suddenly figures out that there's something wrong with the cash flow. I mean, the numbers seem to add up. There's something wrong with the cash flow. There are several meetings with this woman. She puts on her game face. She seems stressed. They can't figure out, but then they eventually, as you always do, because when the money runs out, there's no money, they realize that she has been diverting money the whole time. On the basis of different strange contracts, marketing contracts, things like that were not really approved. But since she was running the accounts, okay. Now, the way this works is that a guy will come in. If you notice that, she's older and she suddenly got a younger guy, maybe a foreigner, good-looking guy, it just doesn't seem to match, right? She's a little bit of a homebody. He's definitely not. 10 years younger, whatever, maybe that should be a tip-off, or maybe I'm just reading into it after the fact. We've seen a few of these things. Actually, we've actually seen this happen several times to varying degrees. Actually, in one case, it was a young woman, much younger. She wasn't older, but it was the same type of thing with a boyfriend. Now, what happens is this guy, for a certain period of time, you could say he seduces her or whatever. They're together. Okay, they're together, right? But then the pressure comes, and he exposes who he really is, and he says, I know where your mom lives or your kids, and she is put under pressure. So she starts diverting money. In the end, the only one who's going to go to jail in that case is this poor woman, right? This poor woman. And really what you need to do is try to get the police involved and try to build a racketeering case so it's not just the poor woman, because she's going to hang on this. She's going to go to jail. Her life is ruined. They'll employ somebody like us to find her assets, seize her house. She probably won't have that much herself. But where'd the money go, and how did that work? What happens is she pays invoices from another legitimately set up company, probably even in the same jurisdiction, and that company's invoicing for, say, marketing, for various services, might be like fixing the computers, stuff that's like hard to go back 4 months. Wait, do we have a computer problem? What was really fixed, right? But the money adds up over time. Now, why does the guy that owns that company if he's even using his real name. Why does that guy not go to jail, or why is he not prosecuted? Well, because the invoice is legitimate. The services are hard to disprove. The one thing you can prove is that she shouldn't have been making these decisions and sending this money out on her own. And then, in the end, she's the one that goes down. The organized crime group that is making all this money, right? None of those guys go to jail. Now, this type of thing does happen. And you say, well, I mean, how often could it happen? Well, look what we just talked about. 7 years ago, 100 billion euro in revenue. How does that all happen? It doesn't all happen but drugs. But in the cases that I mentioned, because we did a case where there was like literally, don't go to that part of the warehouse is off limits. That's what it became. They were storing drugs in a legitimate company, manufacturer, in part of their warehouse, and nobody would go there. No one would go there to check. So the goal of these groups is to actually infiltrate real companies, because it makes it so much easier for them to actually make money, steal money, launder money, the whole thing. So keep that in mind. I hope that was a help. In next shows, we're going to talk about different types of those crimes. We're going to get into the different mafia figures, types of mafia, the crimes going on, some of the politics also here, and then maybe we may do some kind of other fun things, focus on crime figure of the month that type of thing. Maybe we should even get into some highlight some crime fiction, get into that type of thing. We'll do some. I've got some ideas. Otherwise, look, if you have any issues, serious issues, or you just need some advice, these can range from anything from surveillance needs to litigation support to pre-transaction, these types of things. Feel free to get in touch with me. Hit the website www.cddi.eu. You can find me there. Find me on LinkedIn, and I will do my best to respond as quickly as I can. And that's all. Over and out. I hope to talk to you soon. Be safe, be wary, and don't let the bad guys get you down. Bye-bye.
That's right. Here's your Rockabilly Circus ringmaster to tell you a story. It's a story about the deep dark time.